This lecture will be about the composition of the state territory. The geopolitical field is a term for a space under the state's control. The geopolitical field is not about law, but politics. It describes the state's perception of the area under its control. It may coincide with the country's territory, go beyond it, like Russia's geopolitical field that includes Transnistria, for example, or be less than the territory of a country. For example, in the 90s, Russia's geopolitical field did not include Ichkeria, Chechen Republic. Therefore, the geopolitical field is a subjective and dynamic characteristic of the state. In geopolitics, we use different terms for specific types of the geopolitical fields. First, the endemic geopolitical field, an area controlled by the country for a long time. Its neighbors recognize the territory as an indispensable part of the nation. Second, the peripheral geopolitical field, an area under the country's control, but not properly developed in terms of population, economy, or politics. Although the neighbors may sometimes question its belonging to the nation, they do not consider this territory theirs. Then the third, the cross geopolitical field, an area under the country's control, but systematically influenced by other states. Then we have the phantom geopolitical field, an area portrayed as the state's part, but in fact controlled in some means by another state. And finally, the fifth, the total geopolitical field, that reflects the country's views of its potential to expand state's control over different areas. The study of ways to maintain and expand the country's geopolitical field is a key strand of geopolitical research. Traditionally, the basic tools of this have included administrative and political, military and demographic control over the territory. Yet the list has recently been expanded to include economic, value-based, and even informational resources. The world political map is subject to constant change. Let's discuss different types of territorial changes classified on this table. Among the main types of territorial changes are independence movement, the emergence of a new state like South Sudan in 2011. Consolidation or unification of several states into a single state, like the Italian unification at the end of the 19th century. Today, such sentiments are strongest in Moldova and Romania. Incorporation, the voluntary union between two states. For example, Tuvalu's incorporation into the USSR in 1944. Secession, the unilateral withdrawal from an entity, from a state, with a view to creating a new independent state, like Eritrea did in secession from Ethiopia in 1993. Along with autonomization, secession constitutes one of the basic strategies employed by separatist groups that call for some ethnic groups' independence from the larger group. Separatists may be ethnic, like in Flemish region in Belgium, religious, like in Bosnia and Herzegovina, ethno-religious, like in Ulster in Ireland, linguistic, like in Quebec in Canada, racial, like in Namibia, economic, like in Lombardy in Italy, or even social, like in Scotland. Although secessionist movements are commonplace to modern politics, they greatly differ from each other. First, in the extent to which they are supported by people. Take, for example, secessionism in Wales and Scotland. And, by the way, they effectively control the territory. Compare, for example, Catalonia and Abkhazia. Next type is cession, the voluntary transfer of part of the country's territory to another state. For example, Czechoslovakia's handover of Carpathian Ruthenia to the USSR in 1945. The assignment of territorial property to another entity tends to follow an armed conflict, where the party agrees to cede part of its territory in exchange for peace and its preserved statehood, and sometimes even with the aim of providing compensation for war losses and military costs. Next type is irredenta, the unilateral withdrawal of part of the country's territory to join another territory, like Crimea's withdrawal from Ukraine to join Russia in 2014. Unlike cession, secession and irredenta imply that it's not the entire state, but only its part that determines the future of its territory. In other words, this very part seeks to exercise its self-determination right, so that it will require changes in the national borders. While secession means that the region unilaterally withdraws from the state to form a new entity, irredenta signifies the same unilateral decision, but taken to join another state. Irredentist projects exist in Northern Ireland, Transnistria, Republic Srpska, and some other regions, which advocate for being incorporated into Ireland, Russia, Serbia, and some other countries. A special subcategory of small-scale irredenta is identified, which implies that part of a country wants to unite with another country's region, like South Ossetia wants to join North Ossetia in Russia. Another change type, territorial loss, the involuntary transfer of part of the territory to another state. For example, the French loss of Alsace and Lorraine in 1940. Disintegration, the territorial separation into separate countries, like the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Then the division, the voluntary act of dividing the state so that its parts join different states, like the division of Bengal between India and Pakistan along the religious lines in 1947. Partition, the involuntary act of dividing the state into parts. For example, the third partition of Poland by Russia, Austria, and Prussia at the end of the 18th century. Both disintegration and partition mean that a given state splits into two or more unions. The two processes are accompanied with the gravest problems, like the paralysis of government and the end of top-down decision-making, then the breakup of a common economic, trade, and currency space, then aggravated problem of the former national army and law enforcement bodies scattered across the state, then the polarization of society, and finally the threat of intervention. Another type is liquidation, the abolition of state institutions within the country's territory. For example, the liquidation of German Democratic Republic as a result of the integration of the eastern territories of Germany in 1990. Anschluss, the voluntary decision to destroy statehood and integrate into another state. The political union of Austria with Germany achieved through annexation by the latter in 1938. The conquest, the subjugation and assumption of control of the state by the aggressor's military force. Iraq's takeover of Kuwait in 1990. The next three types of territorial changes, namely territorial adjudication, retortion, and reprisal, share the requirement for the external legal assessment of the situation. Territorial adjudication is a method of determining changes in the state territory employed by the international court. According to today's international principles, disputes between states, including territorial ones, are taken to the Hague-based International Court of Justice. States usually turn to adjudication in small-scale territorial disputes, hoping that a third-party mediator will delimit boundaries of the territories in question and legitimize them. The strip located on the border of Chad and Libya became the largest territory whose fate was decided through adjudication. Retortion is an unfriendly act that is directed by one state against another state in retaliation for an equally unfriendly act. The Ruhr occupation in 1920s by French and Belgian troops may serve as an illustration of territorial changes of that type. Reprisals entail asymmetric measures directed by one government against another state in retaliation for the commission of unfriendly acts. For example, in 1914, Germany raided and destroyed the Portuguese town of Nolila in retaliation for free soldiers being killed in a tragic mistake. There are physiographic types of territorial changes related to the coastline, such as accretion, regression, and transgression. Marine accretion is the addition of land to a state as a result of sand and earth being washed up by the sea. Marine regression is the addition of land to a state, which occurs when areas of submerged seafloor are exposed above the sea level. And marine transgression is the reduction in land when sea level rises relatively to the land and the shoreline moves toward higher ground. Marine accretion has enabled some countries to add significant portions of territory. Bahrain and Macau have experienced a 70% increase. Singapore and Monaco, on the map, a 20% increase. The most important example of marine regression is the shrinkage of the Aral Sea, which expands the territory of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The same problem is facing the Dead Sea between Israel and Jordan. As it is well known, King Richard III yells out loudly his famous phrase, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," in William Shakespeare's play. But this begs the question whether it's possible to give or sell the state's territory. It may be acquired, say, to house or cottage or a farm. Despite being transferred to a private owner, the territory remains under the state's sovereignty. For example, Greece, which puts up its Aegean Islands for sale to foreigners, retains sovereignty over them. Nonetheless, there are well-known cases of acquiring territorial sovereignty. With a few exceptions, the country agrees to sell its lands when it is possible to exercise real control over them. Take, for example, Alaska sold by Russian Empire to the United States. Apart from being bought and sold, the territory may also be just given or presented. In 1990, island Comacchina was given to Belgium. The island was returned to the Italian government the next year on condition that the commune of artists will stay there. It could be put in pledge. Genoa put Corsica in pledge to France in the 18th century to repay its debts. Yet it never managed to repay them. It could be inherited. Russian Emperor Paul I inherited part of Schleswig-Holstein along the Danish-German border from his father. And it could be received as a part of dowry. Lithuanian Grand Duke received Poland after his marriage in the 14th century. Finally, if the territory may be bought, it may also be exchanged for another territory. In most cases, the exchange takes place when the sides delimit the borders. Swapping small pieces of land makes it easier to draw the line between the countries. For example, in 1951, the USSR ceded some small part of Ukraine to Poland in exchange for the equivalent small territory. So those are the types of territorial changes.